Hi, it's AJ, and welcome back. And tomorrow, the VIP program starts. Yes! I'm very, very excited, and I hope you will join me in the new VIP program because it's a special program for me for very special people. Now, today, I want to talk about something very important, and the topic is leadership thinking. Leadership thinking. How do successful people think? How do successful people make decisions? How do true leaders make decisions? Because they don't make decisions in the same way that most people do. So I want to talk about this. It's very important. And I'm going to talk about my own personal way of making decisions that has helped me become very, very successful in a short time. And I want to share this with you. So when you have a decision to make, you're trying to decide, what should I do? Maybe you're trying to decide, should you join the VIP program? Maybe you're trying to decide, should you get a new job or should you quit your old job? Any decision, really, even a small decision, like should you buy some certain food at a restaurant or not? Or what should you eat today? Right? So we have very small decisions, very big decisions, but successful people and leaders, they think about decisions differently. So let me share with you kind of the two important parts of making decisions. And I think about this with almost every decision I make. And when I forget to do this, that's when I make mistakes. That's when I make stupid decisions. So I try to remember these two steps every time I decide about anything. I mean, what I'm going to eat, what I'm going to do, what I'm going to buy, when will I travel, everything. I think about these two important things to be successful and to be a great leader. So what are they? Well, the first thing I think about is investing. What does that mean? Investing is a business word, right? Not really. Investing means you put something in. For example, you spend some money. But when you invest with money in business, for example, what do you hope? Well, you hope that in the future, sooner or later, the money will come back to you and even more money will come, right? That's investing. In a savings account in your bank, you put $100 in there. And the next month, you gain a little more. Not much for a savings account usually, but a little bit more, maybe 10 cents. So you have your $100 and then you get 10 cents more. Now you have $100 and 10 cents. That is investing, right? You got something more than you put in. That's good investing. Now, bad investing, that's when you put something in, you spend something, and then you lose some. So you put in $100, and next month you only have $90. You lost $10. That's a bad investment. So this is how I think about most decisions. This is the first thing I think about. So, for example, most people, they think about cheap and expensive. If they're going to buy something, they think, is the price cheap or is the price expensive? And then they decide. If it's cheap, they think it's good. Expensive, they think, oh, maybe not good. But they don't think about investing. Let me give you an example. I always think about cheap and expensive with an investing mindset, an investing idea. So for me, I will happily, easily spend $6,000 for a business seminar, for a business class. $6,000 for me is cheap if I know that I will learn a lot, and in the future, what I learned will help me make even more and more and more money. I will make $6,000 and then $10,000 and then $100,000. And all my life, what I learned will help me. I did this. I spent $6,000 for a business seminar, Keith Cunningham's business seminar. It was cheap. It was super cheap because I learned so much that is helping my business, that is helping me personally. I know easily in the future, in fact, already, I gained more than $6,000 benefit. And all my life, this knowledge, what I learned, it will be with me all my life. It will help me all of my life. For me, that $6,000 was cheap because I think about investing. Now, on the other hand, for me, a $3 or $4 Starbucks coffee is super, super expensive. It's more expensive than the business seminar. Now, most people think that sounds crazy. Why? Because I know that coffee will not help me in the future. In fact, I know it will hurt my health. It will make me less healthy. Yes, I'll get a little energy from sugar and caffeine for a few hours, but then later my energy will go down, my health will go down. It will not help me in the future. So for me, that $3 or $4, it's totally a waste of money. In fact, it's hurting me. It's a very bad investment. And therefore, in my mind, that coffee is super expensive. So do you see how I think about things differently? It's not the amount, it's what will it give me in the future for the rest of my life. If I know I will get a lot of knowledge, of happiness, of money, of all of those, or some of them, then that's a good investment, that's cheap. If I know it will hurt me in the future or not help me, then I know it's expensive, it's a bad investment, and I won't do it. So I hope that makes sense to you, and I hope you will start to think about all of your decisions in this way. That's the first thing you need to do. Now, there's a second part of leadership thinking. The second part is contribution. Right? Part one, investing, is really about just me. Will it help me more and more in the future? Great, yes, then I'll do it. But then I also think, the next step, I think, okay, not just me. Will this help other people now and in the future? So again, the business seminar I went to. What I learned helped me, of course, but it will also help other people because my company helps other people. It helps you, the members, right? As my company grows, I help more and more and more people, more members. Also, people work for me. So I give jobs to other people. That is helping a lot of other people. And so, that is contribution. So that business seminar helps me help more people, help other people. It's a great decision to do that. The coffee again. Does that help other people? No, not at all. In fact, usually after a few hours of drinking coffee, my energy goes down, my feeling and mood goes down. Maybe I'm not so good with other people, maybe not so nice. Maybe I'm tired when I'm with other people. And if I drink that coffee every day, my health will go down, 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 and I will not be able to help people as much. I will have less energy for other people. I will be less happy. That will not help other people. No contribution. Again, it's a bad decision. Now, I know a lot of people drink coffee. I'm not attacking coffee. It's just an example from my life. I quit coffee about 6 weeks ago. No more coffee. Because I thought about this decision. Is it helping me long term? Is it helping me? And I decided, no, it's not. And I decided, is it helping other people? And I realized, no, it's not. So I quit. And the same with the seminars. I will spend thousands and thousands of dollars if it will help me in the future continue to grow and have a benefit, and if it will help other people. So, some of you are asking a lot of emails and questions. Should I join the VIP program? Should I try it? Well, it's only $1 to try for one week, so Probably yes, try it. But if you want to think more deeply, think in this way. Will it help you grow in the future? Will it give you something in return? And will it help you help other people? If yes and yes, then yeah, definitely do it. Okay, now something else to help you now. So that's leadership thinking. Think about this with everything, with the VIP program decision, yes, but with all your decisions in your life, in school, in business, at your job, with your family, with your friends, everything you buy. Think about this, investing idea and contribution idea. Okay, so as you know, tomorrow's the big day. Now with Power English, we had a crazy time back in August, remember? So many people, over 500,000 people trying to get Power English. Only a few thousand could get the program. It crashed our website. It was crazy. Now this time I think we are more ready. We have a much better computer system this time. So that's good. But still, I want you to think about this decision carefully, using those two things I just talked about. But also, think about it, is it for you? Because the VIP program is not for everyone, and it's an exclusive group. It's a special group. Now, there's two things I want you to think about before you decide to get the VIP program, to join it tomorrow. The first thing, I want you to think about the code of Effortless English. Do you agree to follow the code? If yes, good. If no, do not get the VIP program. Do not join. Okay? The VIP program is only for people who agree to follow the code. Remember, the code is do your best. Right? Do your best. Will you do your best? Will you make mistakes? Of course you will, but will you try to do your best? Number 2, will you do the right thing? Will you be a good person? And number 3, will you show other people that you care? If yes, and yes, probably the VIP program is good for you. But there's one more thing I want you to think about, and that's the results that you want. What kind of results? What do you want? So the VIP program will give you 3 results. Result number 1, confident English speaking. I will teach you to speak confidently. Yes, you will speak quickly, easily, and automatically, but also with confidence. You'll feel strong and relaxed. I want other people to listen to you and respect your ideas. Do you want that? If yes, well, that's good. Number 2, do you want personal success in all parts of your life? Do you want to feel stronger and healthier, have more energy? Do you want to get a better job, better career, make more money, have a better business? Great. Do you want better friendships and have a better success in your family? Better success in all parts of your life. That's part 2. And finally, part 3, most importantly, I think. Will you help other people? Will you help your family and friends? Do you want to help other Effortless English members? Will you use your confidence, use your success to help other people? That is important. You must answer yes or do not join the VIP program. So if you answered yes to all of those questions, all of those ideas, then yes, the VIP program is definitely for you. Try it just for $1. Try it for a week. Get those first lessons, including one of the bonus lessons. And, enjoy it. I'm sure you will love it, and I'm sure you will really love the VIP program. I'm going to teach you how to speak English confidently, how to be successful in all parts of your life, and how to help other people. And that's the most important mission we have here at the Effortless English Club. So as I said, tomorrow we open the VIP program and we have a special, just $1 to try the VIP program. You can try it for 7 days for just $1. Now, it's a subscription program, so after those 7 days, there will be a monthly subscription. Every month, I will send you new lessons, a new video, new mini-story lesson, new point-of-view grammar stories, a new commentary about leadership, success, and confidence, and text for everything. Also, of course, you will become a member of the VIP-only social site. Meet all the other VIPs. Together we will grow more successful and become better global leaders. That's what the social site is about. And I have some special surprises only for VIP members. I'm not going to tell you because then it wouldn't be a surprise, but I promise you're going to love the surprises. During the year at different times, I will have special surprises for my VIP members. So, very exciting. I'm so excited about tomorrow. So, I will see you tomorrow. Look in your email. You'll get an email with the link. Click the link. You go to the VIP registration page. Click that yellow button and register your information, and then welcome to the VIP Global Leadership Program. I will teach you how to speak English confidently, how to be successful in all parts of your life, and how to be a true global leader, someone who helps other people. Thank you. I will see you tomorrow. Have a great day and welcome. Bye-bye.